The air in the palace throne room was thick with incense and the stench of wine. A king's drunken oath hung heavy, sharp, and deadly, like a dagger poised over a young neck. She was just 14, a girl named Amestris, a princess whose laughter was meant for flower gardens, not for the cold, calculating eyes of men. But in the ancient world, a princess was not a daughter. She was a coin, a pawn, the highest price in a game of power. Her father, the mighty King Xerxes, had promised the unthinkable. He had given her away to a man old enough to be her grandfather, a general whose heart was stone and whose hands were stained with blood. What happens when a king's pride costs his own daughter her future? This is the story of Amestris, the princess who learned that sometimes the worst betrayal comes not from an enemy's blade, but from a father's disastrous word. What Xerxes did to his own flesh and blood was a fate far worse than death. Watch all the way to the end. There's so much valuable info waiting for you. Don't forget to subscribe, tap like, and share this video. Every bit of support helps our channel grow and inspires us to make even better videos for you. The great hall of the royal palace was a shimmering sea of gold and velvet. Hundreds of oil lamps cast a warm, deceptive glow over the feast, making the wine in the goblets look like liquid rubies. The sound was deafening. The clang of bronze cups, the loud, booming laughter of the great King Xerxes, and the constant murmur of 1,000 courtiers and generals. It was a celebration of Xerxes' latest victory, a triumph of iron and willpower, and the king was riding a high wave of pride and drink. Princess Amestris sat at the high table, a small, quiet figure in a dress of soft white silk. She was barely 14, old enough to be married in this world, but still young enough to secretly wish for a pet puppy rather than a husband. She looked out at the boisterous crowd, her dark eyes wide. She loved her father, Xerxes, with a fierce devotion, but tonight, he was becoming the man she feared. Loud, boastful, and completely reckless. Beside her, General Artabanes was a stark contrast to the colorful, younger nobleman. He was an old lion, his hair a shock of white, his face a map of old battle scars. He was powerful, respected, and utterly ruthless. Amestris often felt his eyes on her, not with affection, but with a cold, assessing gaze, as if she were a piece of valuable land he was planning to acquire. Tonight, that gaze felt heavier than usual. Xerxes, standing at the head of the table, raised his magnificent golden cup. His voice, already strained from hours of talking, roared across the hall. "My friends, my loyal brothers in arms," he shouted, spilling a little wine. "Tonight, we celebrate the unbreakable strength of Persia. I am king. I am the great king, and to show my eternal gratitude for your service, I make this promise. Anything requested of me tonight in this hall will be granted. I swear it on my crown and my life. Ask what you will." A cheer erupted. This was typical Xerxes, grand, generous, and utterly incapable of thinking through the consequences of his dramatic statements, especially when he drank an entire pitcher of wine. The courtiers knew this was a dangerous moment, a game of high stakes. The king's word, once given, was sacred. To break it would be to invite disaster, to weaken his authority, and to challenge the very gods who supposedly put him on the throne. Xerxes had sealed himself in a golden trap, and the entire room felt the sudden, terrifying silence that followed the cheering. Artabanes, the aging general, did not cheer. He merely watched the king, a faint, cold smile playing on his lips. He was one of the few men in the room who understood the deep, terrifying weight of Xerxes' promise. It was not just a generous gift. It was a political weapon, waiting to be claimed. He knew exactly what he would ask for. Amestris, meanwhile, was focused only on her father, willing him to sit down, to stop talking, to put an end to this dangerous game. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a dreadful premonition, a cold wave washing over the warmth of the feast. She didn't know what would happen, but she knew, with the certainty of a child who understands her parents' weaknesses, that something terrible was about to be unleashed by his pride. And then Artabanes rose. His movements were slow and deliberate, drawing every single eye in the massive hall. Even Xerxes, giddy with wine and power, looked slightly startled. The general walked slowly, his armor clinking softly, until he stood directly before the king. He did not kneel. He simply bowed his head, a gesture of respect that somehow felt more like a challenge. "My king," Artabanes said, his voice gravelly and low, but carrying clearly through the now silent hall. "Your generosity is a light unto the world. You have asked us to name our deepest desire, and I shall name mine." He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes flicking back toward the high table, resting squarely on the face of the young Princess Amestris. "I ask, great king, for the hand of your daughter, Princess Amestris, in marriage." The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to suck the very air out of the room. Amestris felt her small body go instantly, terrifyingly cold. She was no longer watching a distant drama. She was the object of the drama. Her mind couldn't process the words. Marriage? To Artabanes? Felt like a sick joke. She looked at her father, her eyes pleading. Xerxes's face, a moment before flushed with wine and triumph, went instantly pale. The drunken glaze vanished, replaced by a horrible, stark sobriety. He stared at his most loyal general, trapped, realizing the catastrophic cost of his own vainglorious promise. He had sealed his daughter's fate, and his own, with a single arrogant sentence. The moment Artabanes spoke the request, the atmosphere in the great hall changed from a joyous celebration to a funeral watch. Everyone present understood the terrible implications. Xerxes was caught. If he refused the general, he would break his sacred oath. Breaking an oath made in front of his entire court, sworn on his crown, was not just rude. It was an act that could shake the foundations of his authority and invite rebellions. It would brand him as a liar and a weak king who could not control his own words. But if he agreed, he would be sentencing his young daughter to a life of political servitude with a man who felt no love for her, only ambition. Xerxes loved Amestris, in his own rough, distant, kingly way. The horror of the choice twisted his stomach. Artabanes waited, his face utterly unreadable. He had gambled on the king's pride, and he knew he was about to win. He was an aging general who had risked his life for decades. What better reward than to bind himself to the royal bloodline? His children would be semi-royal. His family's power would be cemented for generations. Amestris was merely the tool for this vast political transaction. Xerxes shifted, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes. He looked at Amestris. She was frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the high table so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes were fixed on him, wide and brimming with unshed tears, silently begging for rescue. He could hear her plea without her uttering a single sound. The king tried to bargain. He had to save face and save his daughter. "Artabanes," Xerxes boomed, trying to inject authority back into his voice. "Your service is beyond measure, but this request is too great a price even for you. I swore to grant anything, but I will grant you something greater than my daughter." The king gestured wildly toward his vast treasury. "I will give you a city, a kingdom to rule. I will give you more gold than you can count, jewels that outshine the stars. I will give you 10, 20, even 50 of the finest horses in the royal stables. Ask for any treasure, My entire kingdom is yours, save for this one life." Xerxes was desperate, listing things he valued highly: power, wealth, territory, trying to convince the general that these material things were better than his daughter. But Artabanes merely shook his head, calmly and respectfully. "My king, you mistake my heart. I have served you not for gold or land or the fleeting rule over a city. I serve you for the glory of Persia. I have enough wealth. I have enough land. What I truly desire is to be linked forever to the royal line, to strengthen the crown through marriage. I desire the honor of calling your royal blood my own. You promised anything, great king, and only the hand of the princess Amestris is the thing I desire." The general's response was a masterstroke of political manipulation. He had reframed his greedy request as an act of selfless loyalty to the king and the nation. He was publicly reminding Xerxes that by refusing him now, Xerxes would be putting his personal feelings above the good of the empire, and, worse, breaking his holy promise. A hush fell over the courtiers. They watched Xerxes, knowing the trap had sprung shut. His face was a mask of agony. He squeezed his eyes shut for a long moment, battling his pride against his paternal love. But the image of his broken oath, the public shame, the potential for instability, was a monstrous threat to his kingship. In the end, the king's duty to his crown and his own colossal pride outweighed the welfare of his child. He was, first and foremost, the king of Persia, and only second, the father of Amestris. When Xerxes finally opened his eyes, they were cold, devoid of the warmth Amestris knew. He looked not at his daughter, but at Artabanes, and his voice was a low, defeated growl. "General Artabanes," he said, the words cutting through the air like ice. "The king's word is law. You have asked, and I must grant. The princess Amestris shall be your wife." Amestris didn't scream. She didn't cry. The shock was too great. She felt the heavy, cold realization that her father, the most powerful man on earth, had just condemned her. Her whole world, in the space of 3 short sentences, had crumbled into dust. She was no longer a person. She was a political bond, a seal of duty, and a prisoner of her father's pride. The feast ended not with a cheer, but with a terrible, stifled silence. As soon as King Xerxes gave his final, fatal word, Amestris felt a powerful, unseen force detach her from the life she knew. She was escorted back to her private chambers, not by her usual playful maidens, but by stern, silent servants of Artabanes. Her luxurious room, once a sanctuary, now felt like the first cell in a political prison. She stood by the window, watching the moonlight fall on the distant royal gardens. She remembered only yesterday, running through those gardens, believing her future was hers to decide. Now she was less than a slave. A slave might at least be bought and sold again, retaining some value. She had been given away, a trophy claimed from the king's table. Later that evening, her mother, Queen Achaemenid, came to her. The queen was a woman of fierce spirit, but tonight, she looked utterly defeated. She sat beside Amestris on the bed, holding her close, tears streaming down her face. "My daughter," Achaemenid whispered, her voice rough with sorrow, "forgive your father. He is a king before he is a man. He thought only of his sacred promise, of the stability of the crown. Artabanes is a powerful general, vital to our safety." Amestris pulled back slightly, her gaze cold. "Did he think of me, mother? Did he think of the child he holds every night? I am 14. Artabanes is older than you are. He looks at me like a hawk looks at a small, helpless bird. This is not stability, mother. This is sacrifice." Achaemenid had no answer for that because it was the truth. In the politics of ancient empires, The suffering of one princess was a small price for the allegiance of a powerful general. Amestris was a national insurance policy, a living contract written in her own heartbreak. The wedding preparation was a frantic, terrifying blur. Artabanes, fearing the king might try to renege on the deal once he sobered up, insisted on the ceremony taking place immediately. Within 3 days, Amestris was taken from her father's palace and delivered to the imposing, fortress-like home of the general. There was no joy, no celebration, only heavy silence and cold ritual. She was dressed in the finest silks, adorned with jewels, but she felt like an animal decorated for slaughter. The marriage itself was a nightmare of public duty. Amestris stood beside Artabanes, feeling the crushing weight of his presence. He was not cruel in public, he was merely possessive. He held her hand with an iron grip, his ancient, spotted skin rough against hers. Every move he made was designed to show the court that this prize, this royal blood, was now his. In the general's palace, Amestris quickly realized the suffocating reality of her new life. Artabanes was utterly preoccupied with power and military strategy. He saw her only as the symbol of his elevated status. He demanded obedience, silence, and the production of heirs to fully cement his new royal ties. There was no affection, no kindness, and certainly no love. Her new home was a place of iron discipline. The servants feared Artabanes, and his rules were rigid and unforgiving. Amestris was no longer a carefree princess. She was the general's property, expected to represent the royal house with perfect dignity, all while dying slowly of loneliness inside. She retreated entirely into herself. She began to speak less, to smile less. The vibrant, curious girl was slowly being replaced by a pale, silent woman. Her world became a beautiful cage, locked with a golden key, surrounded by velvet furnishings that offered no comfort. She ate little, slept poorly, and spent her days reading ancient scrolls or staring blankly at the stone walls, a prisoner trapped by the devastating consequences of her father's pride. Xerxes had given her a life that looked grand from the outside, but was hollow and utterly suffocating within. The cost of the king's word was the soul of his daughter. Months turned into a year, and the beautiful, lively Princess Amestris withered into a quiet, spectral wife. She performed all her duties flawlessly. She hosted the required dinners, she received the required guests, and she stood perfectly still beside General Artabanes at state functions. But beneath the expensive silks and the jewels, she was a statue carved from ice. The quiet, relentless resentment she felt toward her father began to poison her soul. It was a secret, silent grief. How could the man who taught her to ride horses and who told her stories of heroes sacrifice her so easily for a promise made in a drunken stupor? She rarely saw Xerxes anymore. He would visit her husband's home for political meetings, but he avoided any meaningful interaction with her. He knew what he had done, and the sight of her pale, silent face was a living accusation he could not face. Amestris's isolation was profound. She had no friends in her new life. Her old friends from the palace were kept away by the strict rules of the general and the intimidating atmosphere of his home. She spent hours in the quiet, dusty library, losing herself in stories of heroes and tragic lovers, wishing for an escape that would never come. She desperately needed a confidant, someone to whom she could express the pain that was slowly crushing her. She tried once, cautiously, to speak to one of the older maids, asking a simple question about life outside the general's walls. The maid's eyes immediately darted to the door, full of fear. "Madam," the maid whispered, looking terrified, "Artabanes keeps his household silent. We see nothing, we hear nothing. It is safer that way." Amestris learned her lesson instantly. She was surrounded by watchers, not servants. Her life was an open book to her powerful husband, and any sign of unhappiness or rebellion would be swiftly and silently crushed. Her cage was not just velvet. It was lined with watchful eyes and fear. This constant suppression of emotion began to take a heavy toll on her physical health. She suffered from headaches that never seemed to go away. She began to eat less and less, finding food tasteless and heavy. Her natural youthful glow disappeared, replaced by a permanent pallor. She would often stand before the bronze mirror and barely recognize the person staring back. The young girl was gone, replaced by a haunting shadow of a political wife. One day, while tending to the small, enclosed garden in the general's courtyard, Amestris felt a wave of dizziness so strong she had to lean against a stone bench. She was thin and weak. She realized, with a chilling clarity, that she was truly starving, not just for food, but for affection, for freedom, and for the simple right to be loved. She had to remind herself daily of the political importance of her sacrifice. She was the bond that kept the mighty general loyal to the king. Her suffering was necessary for the stability of the entire empire. This duty, this heavy weight of importance, was the only thing that kept her moving forward. But one night, as the cold Persian moon shone through her window, Amestris found herself unable to sleep. She walked to the window, feeling the profound, aching loneliness of her situation. She remembered the warmth of her father's touch when she was a small child. That memory, once a source of comfort, now turned sharp with betrayal. She wept silently, finally allowing the tears that had been frozen inside her for a year to fall. She wasn't weeping for her lost life. She was weeping because she knew this silence, this emptiness, would never end. She was trapped in a slow, agonizing fate that truly was worse than any quick death on a battlefield. She was still alive, but her spirit had been executed. Amestris continued her life as the silent, perfect wife, but the human heart, even when imprisoned, always yearns for a sliver of connection. That connection came in the form of a young scribe named Darius. Darius was barely 20, new to the general's household, and often assigned to bring Amestris scrolls from the library or record household inventories. Unlike the other servants, Darius did not look at Amestris with fear, but with genuine, sorrowful respect. He was clearly aware of her story and her quiet suffering. They spoke only in brief, necessary sentences about documents or books, but in those exchanges, Amestris felt a breath of fresh air. Once, when handing her a heavy scroll, his fingers briefly brushed hers, and she saw a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. A brief acknowledgement that she was a human being, not just a general's trophy. This small, innocent connection became Amestris's lifeline. She began to look forward to the moments Darius appeared. She would ask for increasingly complicated scrolls, just to see him for a few minutes. They never spoke of their feelings or of the general, but they shared silent, sad glances, a mutual recognition of the suffocating atmosphere of the house. For the first time since her marriage, Amestris felt a tiny, fragile spark of hope that she was not completely invisible. The general, however, was a man of immense power, and Artabanes had eyes everywhere. He was a master of political maneuvering and household control. He was utterly obsessed with maintaining his image of authority and his ownership of the king's daughter. He noticed the subtle change in his wife, the slight straightening of her shoulders when Darius was near, the brief lift of her head. It was a minuscule defiance, but in Artabanes's world, any act not explicitly approved by him was an act of treason. One afternoon, Amestris was seated in the library. Darius entered, bringing a list of supplies. As he set the parchment on the table, he allowed himself a small, nervous smile. "May the great gods bring you comfort, princess," he murmured, a phrase of genuine kindness, not duty. Amestris's face softened for a fleeting moment. "Thank you, Darius," she replied, her voice soft. That single, simple exchange was all it took. That evening, the air in the general's palace was unusually heavy and still. Amestris was called to Artabanes's private study. He stood by the fire, a towering, menacing silhouette. He didn't look angry. He looked calmly, terribly resolved. "My wife," he said, his voice dangerously smooth, "I married you for a political purpose. You are the embodiment of my loyalty and my power. You are not here to seek comfort or companionship from staff. You are here to be silent and to represent the king's decision." Amestris remained silent, fear gripping her throat. "I observe all things in my house," Artabanes continued, his gaze piercing. "I observe the longing in your eyes and the hopeful glance of the young scribe, Darius. Such misplaced sentiment is dangerous. It pollutes the honor of the king's gift." The general then snapped his fingers. A guard immediately entered the room, dragging the young scribe. Darius's face was bruised and pale, his clothes torn. Amestris gasped a small, choked sound. "This is what happens to those who forget their station," Artabanes stated, not raising his voice. He looked directly at Amestris. "You seek human comfort? You seek kindness? I am your husband. Your only duty is to me. Let this be your reminder." He gave a silent command to the guard, and Darius was brutally dragged away, his quiet plea for mercy echoing down the stone corridor. Amestris stood frozen, realizing the true nature of her prison. Her husband did not merely confine her. He was actively destroying any source of light or warmth that tried to penetrate her life. The general had crushed her hope beneath his heel. She learned then that her silent suffering was not enough. She had to be utterly and completely empty inside. Her father's pride had cost her her freedom, but the general's cruelty ensured that she would pay with her very last shred of happiness. Years passed in the general's fortress. Princess Amestris became Queen Amestris in name when Xerxes eventually passed away and her half-brother took the throne. But her title meant nothing. She was still bound to Artabanes, still a prisoner of that drunken oath made years ago. The general, fueled by his royal connection, grew immensely powerful. He used Amestris's presence to leverage favors, command respect, and intimidate rivals. He had achieved everything he wanted, but he never learned to treat his wife with dignity. Amestris, by now a woman in her 20s, was a ghost of her former self. Her spirit was completely broken, replaced by a quiet, calculating bitterness that began to define her. Her health never recovered from the deep emotional trauma and neglect of her young life. The constant stress, the fear, and the lack of warmth hollowed her out. She was often ill, constantly fatigued, and unable to enjoy the basic pleasures of life. She had fulfilled her duty, bearing Artabanes a single, sickly son, thus cementing the general's claim on royal power. But the effort had nearly destroyed her. One grim, cold morning, Amestris was found lifeless in her chambers. The official pronouncement was that she had died of a sudden illness, a fever that took her quickly. But those who knew her story understood the truth. She had simply starved to death, not for lack of food, but for lack of living. Her heart, crushed by the betrayal and the relentless isolation, had finally given out. She was barely 30 years old, a princess whose life had been tragically cut short, a martyr to political expediency. When the news reached the new king, her half-brother, he was devastated, not just by grief, but by the chilling realization of the price paid for his father's pride. Artabanes, stripped of his royal wife, lost some of his immediate influence, but the damage to the crown was permanent. The political alliances he had forged using Amestris's bloodline remained, forever complicating the new king's reign. The story of Princess Amestris became a whispered legend in the palace halls. It was not a tale of a heroic queen or a beautiful lover, but a cautionary narrative about the true cost of power. The courtiers remembered the great, booming voice of King Xerxes making that impossible promise, and they remembered the terrifying silence that followed. They realized that Xerxes's decision to grant the general's wish saved his pride, but it created a long-term rot within the heart of the royal family. The greatest kings are defined by their strength in battle and their wisdom in governance. Xerxes had the strength, but on that fateful night, when faced with the choice between his word and his child, he showed a fatal lack of wisdom and humanity. He did not kill Amestris with a sword or send her into exile. He did something far crueler. He imprisoned her in a life of cold duty, slowly erasing her identity until she became merely a beautiful vessel for a political contract. The chilling truth echoed through the generations. King Xerxes, in a moment of drunken, boastful pride, had given away more than his daughter. He had sacrificed her very soul to maintain his ego and his oath. The blood that stained his reign was not spilled on the battlefield, but quietly wept behind the closed doors of an unhappy marriage, a fate truly worse than death for the girl named Amestris. Her silence remains the loudest accusation against the absolute power of kings.